Hello, theologians. Welcome back to our class as we look this week to the doctrine of Christology. This is going to be a fun and interesting and I hope illuminating exercise as we look at some of the complexities of Christological heresies that began to eventually give way to what became Orthodox Christology and some of the options that are available to us in there. And then as we look finally to some of the ministerial implications for these particular approaches to Christology. So let's dive in, shall we? Let's take a look at this. The beginning question, I think, that we begin with Christology is this: how can that which is divine become that which is not? If you remember back to the very beginning of the semester, we talked together about the nature of Greek cosmology. And if you remember that for the Greek mind, there was two basic realms. There's the eternal realm and there was the temporal realm. And there's this great big dividing line between those two realms. In other words, that which is eternal and divine and unchanging and perfect really doesn't have anything to do with the temporal realm that is the world of death and decay and all those kinds of things. So obviously this is a cosmology that predates Jesus. It's around in the days of Plato, 500 years or more before Jesus. And yet as people encounter a peasant Jew from Nazareth who they believe to be the divine Son of God, they begin to try to explain what they have encountered in Jesus according to those categories. So if those are the only categories that you've ever known, if those are the only categories that have really been a part of understanding the nature of God, then it makes every bit of sense that you would attempt to describe Jesus in those categories. And so for the study of Christology, I think in many ways we are tempted to do a very similar kind of thing as most of the church tradition has done, but to hopefully this week wrestle a little bit with the way that the church tradition has usually conducted itself by attempting to understand Jesus this way. So if we have already presupposed that there are these kind of two realms, that which is eternal and divine and unchanging and quote unquote perfect, and that is very different from the temporal realm, it makes a lot of problems for us to try to explain how God, this being of the divine, could come to live in the temporal realm. But there were a lot of attempts to be able to do this. And so I want to walk through some of these attempts right now as a way of hopefully coming to understand what the church actually did believe. Because most of these ways, as creative and as inventive as they were actually rejected by the church as heresy. So we study heresy not necessarily because we want to just laugh at how heretical the heretics were. I mean, for the most part, heresies were the church's good faith attempt to try to explain what they've actually encountered in this person, Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of the first, the second, the third century, most of these folks were trying to inventively and creatively explain what it is that they've actually encountered for the very first time. So it's like, we encountered Jesus of Nazareth. We saw him crucified. We saw him resurrected. I mean, these are the stories. This is around in the day. And yet, we need to be able to explain these in some way. And so they're taking their best shot. So what I normally say is that heretics usually get a bad rap. I mean, they were. It's not like they were framed, but they do get a bad rap in the sense that we sometimes tend to think of heretics as like the ones who are like, I'm going to try to do everything I can to dismantle the church tradition and to take down Christian theology. And that really isn't the case. These Christological heresies are the church's best shot in those beginning years of attempting to explain how that which is divine could possibly become human. So they primarily sought to make sense of the way that God became human, and they're primarily going to do this through the lens of Greek cosmology. They're primarily going to do it through the lens of this two-tiered universe. So to be clear, though, the church did reject these theories. But we study these theories. We study what the church rejected for the sake of coming to understand what it is that we actually do believe, what it is that the church actually does affirm and say, hey, we opted not to go with that particular theory, but we are going to go with something that's a little bit different. The second piece of this that I want to highlight is this notion that heresy is still around today. And so it's good for us as theological engineers and theologians in residence to recognize that many of these heresies are not dead. I mean, they are still floating around, and we may often encounter them in our ministry context and our ministry situation. So it's good for us to be able to have some kind of language and vocabulary to be able to understand when we are encountering those particular Christological heresies. The first heresy I want to look at today is Apollinarianism, and this was a Christological heresy that was made popular and proposed by an early 4th century theologian, Apollinarius. And Apollinarius's basic proposition is this: that the divine word replaced the human spirit in Jesus. Or another way that we might be able to say this is that a divine spirit in some ways possessed Jesus' human body. And already in this, we can begin to detect the vestiges of a dualism. You already have in here this suggestion, this Platonic whisper of a divide down the middle of the human person, that the human person has an eternal component, which would be the mind, the spirit, the soul, and the human person has this temporal component, which would be the body, that which is decaying, that which is fading away. And so Apollinarius basically made this very creative proposition that the divine part of Jesus really was divine, or the eternal part of Jesus, this soul, divine soul, really was divine. And the body, well, I mean, the body is actually human. The body is actually very much human, very much prone to death and decay. And so Apollinarius would basically say, yeah, it's okay that Jesus was born of a woman. I mean, that's all right. We're not going to go the Gnostic route and deny that Jesus was born of a woman and just kind of made his appearance as a full-grown man or anything along those lines. Apollinarius wants to affirm, yeah, it's okay. Jesus was born of a woman, actually had a human body. But Apollinarius, in attempting to describe how that which is divine could become human, would say primarily that the body of Jesus is really human and the spirit of Jesus was not human. In other words, it's something other than a human soul, a human mind. The Greek word there is nous, which in the Greek mind is an interplay. I mean, it would be translated as mind or spirit or soul, the kind of internal encapsulated essence of the human person. So you have kind of this possession kind of an approach here. The church ultimately decided to reject this theory, mainly because that which has not been assumed by Jesus in the incarnation, that which has not been taken up by Jesus in his becoming flesh, could not actually be redeemed. And this is a very, very common critique of a lot of the Christological heresies of the early church. To say, well, the moment that you say that there's some aspect of Jesus that is not human, the moment that you say that there is some part of Jesus that has not been assumed in the incarnation, has not been taken up in the incarnation, then that is the very part of Jesus which cannot be redeemed, or that is the very part of humanity which has not been redeemed by Jesus if it really hasn't been assumed or taken up by Jesus. And so for Apollinarius, if our soul has not been assumed by Jesus, if Jesus' spirit, if the essence of who Jesus really is, has truly not been taken up in the incarnation, then we are in trouble, because that is the part of us that also cannot be redeemed. That is the part of us that hasn't been taken up and redeemed into God's life. Another Christological heresy that we'll talk about today is Eutychianism. Kind of a fun one to talk about, at least. Eutychius, another early church theologian, but comes a little bit later than Apollinarius, makes this creative suggestion that Christ is of two natures before the incarnation, and he is only one afterwards. Sometimes this also gets billed as monophysitism, which would be the idea that mono, one, physitism, so nature, a physic, one nature. So Christ is of two natures before the incarnation and one afterwards. And I think this is kind of interesting that that what we encounter in Jesus, in this living, breathing person from Nazareth, is basically the divine, like what we're encountering is the divine nature, because the divine nature essentially kind of trumps the human nature. And Eutychius would basically say that before the incarnation, I mean, we can't affirm that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, because there are these two separate and distinct natures, but that in the incarnation there is this cosmic collision, a cosmic collision of divinity and humanity, and divinity ends up trumping humanity. And so that Christ becomes fully divine in the incarnation. But in some sense, this diminishes what's actually taking place in terms of Christ's humanity. And so again, in this, you already see that there is this presupposition that that there are these two tiers of the universe. There is divinity and there is humanity, and that these two ought not to have much to do with one another. And by virtue of this, then, that the higher eternal piece of Jesus, if you want to put it that way, actually takes precedent over the human part. So again, Eutychius is making a Greek presupposition here that's attempting to say, okay, we've got these two natures now, and how do we read them together as one person? One of the major problems here is that what Apollinarius did for the Spirit, Eutychius now does for the rest of humanity. In other words, if Jesus mainly is becoming divine, then what you have here is a sheerly divine person who has, like, in some sense, overcome humanity itself by wiping away humanity, and so our humanity becomes wiped away in the incarnation of Jesus. So the problem that we talked about in Apollinarianism is wildly appropriated in Eutychianism, mainly because if Jesus has not assumed full humanity, if there's some aspect of our humanity that Jesus has not assumed, then that is the part of our humanity which has not been redeemed. If Jesus has not assumed full humanity in Eutychianism, then Jesus has not redeemed full humanity. And this still gets play around the church, in some sense. I mean, there are some times when you'll bump into folks who are operating in a monophysitism construct when it comes to their Christology, that they may think that Jesus is something other than human. When Jesus walks on the water, for example, I mean, they would basically say, see, Jesus isn't like fully human in this case. The divinity of Jesus is overpowering the humanity of Jesus. And so what we're actually encountering here is not this fully human, fully divine person, but it's more just fully divine, and the humanity tends to get downplayed. So anytime you bump into a Christological notion around the church that tends to downplay the reality of Jesus' humanity, this in some sense goes back to Eutychianism, back to monophysitism, maybe not as sophisticated, but the theological pieces are there to deny Jesus' full humanity. Okay, let's talk about Nestorianism. Nestorianism is another very fascinating and interesting, very creative attempt to explain to us how that which is divine could potentially become human. Nestorius comes a little bit later in the conversation as well, basically a contemporary to Eutychius, and again making a very good faith effort to try to explain how in the world could this one we have encountered be considered to be divine and human. So this one is fairly creative. I like it. Jesus is fully divine and fully human, so he wants to say, okay, I'm not going to play the monophysitism card here. I'm going to say that Jesus really is both of these natures. One does not overpower the other and destroy the other. But I'm going to say that these natures, these two natures in Jesus, don't actually touch in some sense. So there is, for Nestorius, a human side of Jesus, and there is, for Nestorius, a divine side of Jesus, and these natures don't exactly intermingle. They are both present in the person of Jesus, but they don't touch each other. They don't influence one another. They don't mingle or rub off on one another. And so what you basically have here is Nestorius dividing the gospel accounts and saying something like, well, when you see Jesus doing something divine, healing or preaching or walking on, miracles, those kinds of things, that is where Jesus is basically in divine mode, where he's doing divine things. And so he's kind of got the switch flipped, I guess, if you want to talk about it that way. And he's letting his divine nature do what it does. Other times in the gospel accounts, you have Jesus doing just plain human things, and of course these don't get recorded as much. But things like going to the bathroom, the embodied things of human life, of eating and sleeping, and just all of those regular mundane kinds of things of human life. Well, Nestorius would basically say, there it is. That's the human part of Jesus. But the human part of Jesus and the divine part of Jesus really aren't touching one another. They aren't rubbing off on one another. So what you have in the gospel accounts is Jesus using one and then using the other in a separate kind of a way. Kind of an interesting approach, kind of a creative and inventive approach. But again, you can still see how this presupposes the Greek categories of divinity, eternity, over against temporality or humanity. And so you still have Nestorius locked into this presupposition to say it must be in these categories that we understand Jesus. So how do we do this? If we've already made the move to adopt the Greek categories, well, then I think Nestorius is creative and he's inventive, but he's still absolutely locked into those categories to the point where he can't affirm a full humanity and a full divinity, that Jesus is both simultaneously fully human and fully divine, because for Nestorius, there is that Greek division between what is eternal and what is temporal. The church, of course, came to reject this. The church did not want to affirm that the two natures remained absolutely separate in Nestorius. And they did not want to affirm that the divine Jesus does divine things and the human Jesus does human things, basically because this lands us back into the same soteriological logical problem that we have here in Nestorius, and that is, and the rest of the Christological heresies, that is that which has not been assumed by Jesus cannot be redeemed or restored by Jesus. So we do need to affirm that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. There aren't parts of Jesus here. There's full divinity and full humanity. So if you're asking yourself, okay, how do I do this now? How do we understand this conundrum? Because if none of these approaches have been affirmed by the church, well, what do we do then? What do we do? Well, I want to suggest to us a couple of different categories here, or a couple of different models to help understand the nature of Christology and the way that we do our theological work when it comes to Christology. So here are the basic models. You have this Model A, which is what I'm going to refer to as the philosophical model, and Model B, which I'm going to refer to as the incarnational model. In philosophical Model A, you have a beginning point of two ideas. There's a beginning point of taking two separate natures, and then you begin to try to cram those together into one human person, or one Jesus person. You start with divinity, you start with humanity, you start with the presupposition of Greek metaphysics, and you start with the presupposition that these two natures must in some sense be antithetical to one another or be separate in some sense. And then you have to play the game of asking, well, how can they come to live together in Jesus? Are they just situated side by side, like Nestorius would say? Is one going to overcome the other one, as Eutychius would say? Does one need to displace the other one, as Apollinarius would say? And there's lots of other Christological heresies. Docetism, for example, would say that Jesus just appeared to be human, wasn't actually human at all. There's fully divine. And then you are back to the same division of these two natures. So the philosophical model is basically committed to beginning with these two ideas, these two concepts, these two propositions, philosophical modes, philosophical constructs, and then attempting to read them into one person. But what I want to suggest to us today is that a better way of doing Christology is through what I'm referring to as the incarnational model. And that is to take seriously the person of Jesus, to take very seriously the encounter with the very particular Jew from Nazareth, this son of a peasant carpenter who said particular things and did particular things and lived and walked and spoke and was crucified and was resurrected and was ascended, and to take very seriously the encounter with that person as the basis of our Christological enterprise. I think this is phenomenally more helpful when it comes to understanding how Christology works, but also it opens up to us a world of ministerial help when it comes to building a theological bridge. So that you now begin with the encounter with Jesus, this very particular person, and you say, okay, now I've seen what it looks like when someone is fully human and fully divine. So I don't start with two divine concepts, try to cram them together and make them mingle in some sense, or invent some kind of clever philosophical way to explain the incarnation, as much as I'm interested in encountering the person who was incarnated, and then from their particularity deriving an understanding of what it means to be fully human and fully divine. I hope that makes sense. Please let me know in the discussion if this doesn't make sense, or if I've left you in the dust some way. So this opens up to us then a couple of options. According to in Model A, then, we encounter a lot of questions that are very different from Model B kinds of questions. Model A questions tend to want to ask about how Jesus could become both fully human and fully divine. Because if you're beginning with two separate philosophical concepts here, divinity, eternity, on the one hand, and then humanity or temporality on the other, and you try to put those together, it begs a very different set of Christological questions, because it is primarily concerned with attempting to explain how these two natures could coalesce into one person. It starts with philosophical ideas, philosophical concepts. And it says, well, there are these primary categories that exist over and above the incarnation of Jesus. And those primary categories are divinity and humanity, eternity and temporality. And so if we're going to make any sense out of how Jesus could become human, we need to presuppose those categories and try to figure out a way to explain Jesus within those categories. And then as we know Jesus, we figure him out. So what it means to believe in Jesus is to have a kind of intellectual grasp or understanding of how all of this could take place together. Our belief then becomes based upon our ability to unlock the code, unlock the philosophical keys, unlock the basic philosophical questions of how Jesus could be fully human and divine. And so it leads to this propositional kind of a belief. Now, a couple of things I want to suggest here. First, I want to suggest that all of the Christological heresies were basically rejected as Christological heresies precisely because they were asking how questions, precisely because they were so committed to Model A philosophical models of doing Christology, that each and every one of the Christological heresies was attempting to answer a question that Christology itself never really wanted to ask, and that is, how could God become fully human and fully divine? The church eventually comes to a point where it says we're not going to continue asking these how questions because they're not getting us anywhere. What we primarily need to be asking are the who questions. Who is this Jesus who we have encountered? and to begin to pay very, very careful attention, not to the philosophical mystery of how something that is divine could become human, but to simply take Jesus on Jesus' own terms and say, thanks be to God, this is the way that God has chosen to act and be revealed to us. And we need to take the particularity of that revelation very seriously, so that the Christological enterprise is not as concerned with answering a question that Christology itself is never asking. So the church has said, let's begin asking who questions instead. The who questions of who is this Jesus who we have encountered? It starts with this encounter of the person of Jesus, and it works from there. It takes very seriously this notion that Jesus, when he was with the disciples, as recorded in the gospel accounts, did not come to Peter and say, Peter, here's how I want you to believe in me. I want you to have all of the right ideas about me. I want you to have this philosophical construct figured out where you can explain finally once and for all to people how I could become both fully human and fully divine. It's not the way that it works in the gospel accounts. Jesus doesn't ask Peter, either in calling Peter to be a disciple or finally when Jesus is about to go to the cross, how am I? Jesus says, who am I? I want you to pay attention to who I am. Who are people saying that I am? And who do you say that I am? And it's in that question that I think we need to lodge the Christological enterprise. Jesus does not come to us and say, Peter, do you have all of the philosophy figured out here? Do you have all of the conceptual questions figured out? Because if we begin to establish belief in Jesus in the how questions, it begins to establish belief in a sheerly cognitive sense. In other words, do you believe in Jesus? Well, the answer to that question in a cognitive sense is, do you have the right ideas in your mind about Jesus? And this opens up then a very distinct problem for us, and that is that the nature of belief can be disconnected from the nature of practice, the embodied nature of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So here's basically what I mean by this, is that I think all of the time, many times in our ministry, we are serving in and with and among very, very Greek-minded people who are already presupposing a two-tiered universe, this nature of eternal that doesn't touch the temporal. And therefore, the human person reflects that. We have an eternal soul, but the body is just kind of this discarded kind of a lesser than part of what it means to be a human creation, all of these kinds of things. And belief is cognitive. Belief is basically intellectual assent to a set of propositions, agreement. So when we say to someone, do you believe, what we're basically saying to them is, do you agree with me on these particular ideas? Do you give cognitive or intellectual assent to a particular set of propositions? Do you believe that Jesus was fully human and fully divine? Do you affirm both of those things intellectually? And then, as long as you believe those same things and you quote unquote believe them, it leaves the body very disconnected. It leaves the practices of Christian life very disconnected, and so it might lead to something like this. Are you a Christian? Do you believe in these things? Great, then now that we both believe these things, let's go do something with our bodies, or let's go create some kind of a structure that is antithetical to the embodied reality of who Jesus actually was. So the who questions of Jesus, I think, confront us with the particular nature of how Jesus lived his life, the way that he was embodied, the way that he engaged the powers and principalities of his day, the way that he calls us to follow him in a very particular way, the way of discipleship. And it doesn't allow us to get away with this notion of belief as cognitive assent. Belief in the way of Jesus is encountering the who of Jesus and following him on his particular way. It is not just intellectual agreement with ideas about Jesus. It is encountering the who of Jesus and saying, yes, I will follow you. So Jesus confronts us with this question: who do you say that I am? Not how, who. Do you understand who I am? And are you willing to follow me in my particular way? So this takes the particularity of Jesus very seriously. And I think Christologically, we have got to take the particularity of Jesus seriously to really come to any kind of true belief in Jesus. We have to understand that Jesus said this and not this. He did this and not that. In other words, Jesus said things like, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, you've heard it said, do not murder, but I say to you, don't be angry with your brothers and sisters. Don't, I have very particular kinds of commands for those who follow me. I'm saying very particular things about how, as my followers, you are to be in the world. And in saying those particular kinds of things, we also have to pay attention to what Jesus is not saying. That Jesus is, by saying very particular things, not giving permission for this other wide range of possibilities. So, in other words, by Jesus saying, do not be angry with your brothers and sisters, what Jesus is essentially doing is taking off of the table all of the other options that would allow us to be angry with our brothers and our sisters. This is part of just what it means to encounter the particularity of Jesus. We also have to pay very careful attention to what Jesus does and what Jesus does not do. We have to pay very careful attention to the fact that Jesus washes the feet of his disciples rather than kind of lording it over his disciples, being this kind of condescending figure who acts in this kind of authoritarian way above his disciples. We have to pay very careful attention, quite frankly, to the fact that Jesus was crucified, that Jesus did not win according to the world's terms. And the particularity of Jesus signals to us that if we are going to believe in Jesus, we must believe in Jesus not by giving cognitive assent to ideas about Jesus, but by actually getting on the road and following Jesus in his particularity. To say it's not good enough just to agree about ideas. Why? Because the Word became flesh. The Word did not remain in the realm of ideas. The Word did not simply become a set of ideas. The Word became flesh, was embodied in a very particular way, and this is how we have known Jesus. By Jesus coming to know us, by being with us, by standing with us, by speaking with us and saying particular things and doing particular things. Ministerially, I think this matters a lot because it doesn't allow us to get off the hook of particularity. Jesus lived a very particular life, and Jesus died a very particular death. He died a very particular death because his particular way was rubbing up against the powers and principalities of his day. They were challenging the authority structures, not only of the religious establishment, but also of the state. And it ultimately cost Jesus his life. He was ultimately crucified as an agitator, as one who was just doing things in a very peculiar and distinct way that didn't fit the dynamics and constructs of his day, of his society. And so what I want to understand from this is that to follow Jesus in this particular way, to ask the who questions of Christology, is to say, Jesus, who are you? And how do I follow you as you are? Because my belief cannot just be cognitive assent to ideas. To believe in one who has been incarnated, to believe in a Word who has become flesh, means that I can't just agree about how you are in the world. I must encounter you for who you are in the world and recognize that you have called me to follow after who you are. The ministerial implications here are significant and they are numerous. That we cannot just ask our people to agree with particular ideas about Jesus. This is not what it means to be a Christian. What it means to be a Christian is to encounter Jesus in his who-ness. Who are you, Jesus? And how would you have me walk after who you are? What are the particularities of who you are? How have you engaged the world? And then how is it that I am to be faithful to that particular way? So that means, quite frankly, that the way of humility, the way of the cross of Christ, the way of service, the way of all these of doing all the things that Jesus did, is not just a bonus to our ideas about Jesus. This is the very content of what it means to be a Christian. This is the very content of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so the Christological questions are not mainly for us about how Jesus could become both human and divine, but they are the who questions of encountering a person who is fully human and fully divine, and then walking in his very particular way, to encounter him as a person, as this Christ event, and then to pay very careful attention to how he is in the world, to who he actually is, his rhythms, his instructions, his structures, the way that he engages the world. So I hope this has been at least somewhat helpful in terms of learning how to engage the conversation around Christology, and gently to be able to help people when they're trying to come to terms with Christology, to steer them away from the how questions, because most often the how questions will always lead us into some kind of heresy. There's always going to be some form of Nestorianism or Docetism or monophysitism, and to steer them toward the who questions, to say, let me just switch the conversation a little bit here. Let me switch the questions. Who do you think Jesus is? And how are you encountering this very particular person of Jesus? Do you hear him calling you to his particular way? And do you realize that the particularity of Jesus' way doesn't allow you to agree with some ideas about Jesus and then do your own thing? Don't you realize that when you have encountered Jesus, the only way to know Jesus is by the way he has known you, which is by becoming flesh and encountering you as a particular person? One last illustration that I'll leave off with is just kind of the notion of the way that we can agree about ideas with Jesus and then go on our way. Especially when it comes to political season and political seasons in the United States, there's a lot to be said about the way that political candidates, as they're running for office, will always want to flash that faith card, like, hey, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus. And then you begin to see that the particular way that they are embodied in the world, the things that they are doing with their bodies and the structures that they are setting up are actually antithetical to the very nature of who Jesus was. And this goes on both sides of the political aisle. This isn't just reserved for one political party or the other. And I think it's fascinating to see the way that the Greek imagination has so infiltrated this notion that, hey, no, I believe in Jesus. I have certain ideas about Jesus, that Jesus was the Savior of the world and the Son of God, and I agree with those ideas. But the particularity of Jesus' way doesn't necessarily make a claim upon my life. And that's where I think we need to begin making the Christological turn when it comes to moving away from the how questions to the who questions. If Christology is really about how questions, then all we need to do is agree with the right ideas about Jesus. But if Christology is about the who questions, then I think that begs a very different set of questions. Then it's about, no, who is Jesus? Who do you say Jesus is? And how are you going to encounter the particularity of who Jesus is, the way that he says this and not this, the way that he calls you to this way and not to this way. The way that he calls you into his very particular way, and not just any way that you want to attempt to try to baptize, to slap the label Christian on there and then do whatever you want to do. This, I think, came very clearly into my vision very early on in my time here at Trevecca, when I was asked to be a panelist and respond to a very, very smart guy who came to campus to make a presentation. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer who has basically been involved in most of all the free speech cases in and around the United States that deal with some kind of religious liberty. And so if some Christian group is being censored or not allowed to speak out in the way that they want to be able to speak out, he would basically come to their defense and use the mechanics of the legal system to be able to provide their way of free speech. And I thought it was really interesting to listen to him give this presentation, because most of the presentation dealt with how we strategically position ourselves as Christians to win over against our opposition, to maneuver legally and to use legal power and to protect our rights, and then to be able to advance a very particular cause. And most of these causes came to be centered around some social issues like abortion and like human sexuality, I think, were the two big social issues that were in the room. That there's kind of this Christian cause, and that we use this legal system, we use this tool to be able to advance our cause, to make it more known in the world, or something along those lines. And I thought it was fascinating to me that he provided about a 45-minute presentation where he talked a lot about Christianity. Talked a lot about Christianity, that we need to protect Christianity and defend Christianity, and that we're going to use the legal system to be able to do it, use the mechanism of the Constitution and legal arguments and those kinds of things. But I found it very, very fascinating that in a 45-minute presentation where he talked a lot about Christianity, he never did talk about actually Jesus, which was interesting to me. And I recognize that we don't always have to talk about, Jesus' name in every conversation that we have, but I thought, there it is. There's the disconnect between the how and the who questions. Because what I think I was witnessing there was that for him, Christianity is an ideology, or it is an intellectual construct. In other words, Christianity is what happens when you have a bunch of people who come together and agree about the same ideas. And for him, the ideas about which Christians agreed were that we should take this position on abortion and we should take this position on human sexuality. Those are the agreements that we had. And we agree probably too on the fact that Jesus is the Son of God and these kinds of things. We agree on the fact that this is the way the world ought to be and the way that we should take positions on particular social issues. And I just sat there and I thought to myself, when did Christianity become reduced to an ideology that can then be defended by making use of particular tools that Jesus himself did not make use of? And it begins to rub up against the particularity of Jesus in a very uncomfortable way. And so as a respondent on this panel, I was asked to respond, and I basically had to say, well, I hear your cause, I hear your concern. In many ways, I wish Christians could win in our society? Yes, I kind of wish we had all the ability to maintain power and to make sure that the rest of the world is looking at, what Christian causes might be, and to not push those down or silence those in some ways. But as I look at the particularity of Jesus, as I look at the who of Jesus, I am confronted with this, that Jesus did not win. That when Jesus rubs up against the powers and the principalities of his day, he doesn't use the same power structures of his day to be able to advance his ideology or his cause. The who-ness of Jesus tells a very different story, and it sets up a very particular and a very peculiar way of being in the world. He is the one who is humble. He is the one who, rather than using a sword, allows himself to be crucified on a cross. He is the one who rubs up against the powers and principalities of his day, and death becomes the way that he encounters those powers and principalities. He dies. He is ultimately a loser. Now, of course, we recognize the resurrection is there, and that this makes a new way for us, but that this is also part of the strange particularity of Jesus, that Jesus doesn't overcome the powers and principalities according to their own logic. He advances a brand new, different kind of a logic altogether, and that is the logic of sacrifice, kenosis, and resurrection. So I think it's important for us to do the hard work of helping our people come to realize we can't just reduce Christianity to an ideology, mainly because Jesus cannot be reduced to an ideology. Jesus is a particular person. When the Word became flesh, we must encounter the who of Jesus is and walk in his way. And the tough news about this is that doesn't always allow us to do things that are out of alignment with the particularity of Jesus. We must continue to walk in Jesus' particular way, because this is the hope of the world. To say to the powers and principalities that we aren't going to play according to your logic. We have an alternative logic. We have a Christological logic. We have a logic according to the particularity of Jesus, and that is the only logic that we have as Christians to be able to advance in the world. And that, sadly to say, isn't always satisfying to folks like me. Why? Because I'm much more comfortable, I think, with Rome's way of doing things, with Caesar's way of doing things, with Pilate's way of doing things, than I am with Jesus' way of doing things. And I think that it becomes very tricky for us to pastor and to guide people in ministerial settings, to help them understand that you can't just put Jesus' name on a technique. You can't put Jesus' name onto a way of being in the world that is antithetical to the who-ness of Jesus, to the particularity of his personhood, and then go about your business. The who questions demand, have you encountered Jesus? And will you walk faithfully according to his way, even when that way is strange in the world? That's where I think the difference between the how questions and the who questions really begin to flesh themselves out for the sake of ministry. So as we conclude our exploration of Christology for this week, I hope you'll ponder in a deep and profound way Jesus' own question. Who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And then, will you walk according to my way? And my prayer and my hope for all of us this week is that we will not advance Peter's answer, that we will not rebuke Jesus for Jesus then talking to us about the particularity of Jesus' own way, that he must suffer and that he must die, and must be turned over and live in this world according to a very different logic than the logic that is so often found around us. So I hope that you will have a blessed week as we engage in this conversation together, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful time of conversation with you all.